When I was raising money for Vibrato, I used to get these questions from investors. And they'd be like, well, what vertical is this selling to? Is it financials? Is it commerce? And I was like, well, all of them. And they would kind of blink. It was like a new concept, right? Like, because they were just used to like, oh, you're selling to someone. It's cloud computing infrastructure. Everyone needs this.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
Hi, I'm Joseph Ruscio.
Back in 2011, legendary investor Mark Andreessen said that software is eating the world. It was true when he said it, and it's even more true today. But to eat the world, software needs a little help. Behind every massive tech success story is a sophisticated technology infrastructure stack. And powering that stack are some of the most innovative, valuable companies in tech. How do these companies operate? What is the secret to their success? And what can every founder learn from them? We're going to break it all down with a special guest who has had a front row seat. I can't wait to get into it with them right after the break. Listen up. I know a lot of you use dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of those agencies suck. I've been looking for one I can really endorse, and I finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have 100+ experts who don't just code, they solve business problems. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com, that's WARP development.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by .tech domains. One thing about starting your startup that should be easy but isn't is naming it. Why is it so hard? Because all the good .com domain names are taken. So you end up doing something silly like misspelling it or adding random prefixes or suffixes. No more. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so you should make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. Head to get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy to grab your .tech domain today. That's www.get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast. Joe Ruscio is a general partner at Heavybit, one of the top early-stage investors in tech infrastructure companies. Their portfolio is filled with industry leaders including Snyk, Contentful, LaunchDarkly, PagerDuty, and Netlify. But Joseph isn't just an investor, he's lived the founder journey. He has worked on infrastructure and system software for more than 20 years, witnessing successive waves of innovation that have altered the way software is developed and operated. He also co-founded and served as CTO for Vibrato, one of the first cloud-native infrastructure monitoring and observability companies, all of which, of course, makes him the perfect person to discuss tech infrastructure with us. Joe, welcome to the Startup Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Let's start at the beginning. What makes a great tech infrastructure startup?
A tech infrastructure startup and how we think about them at Heavybit is really like products and technology that enables builders, right, to create the next world wave of products, right? So, when I talk about infrastructure, I say, we invest in and back companies who are building products for technical practitioners, basically anything to do with developing, testing, deploying, operating, securing software. What's important about that is, and it comes back to infrastructure products give companies and startups leverage, right? They allow them to build more things with fewer people. The other way to think of it is the old adage of picks and shovels, right? And what I think makes what is great about infrastructure startup companies from my perspective is, whatever, whether it's mobile software or if it's like crypto or if it's like AI, people need to build, and great infrastructure products allow people to build more. They allow people to create more. They get better things into everyone's lives ultimately.
Yeah, I love the picks and shovels analogy. I think it mostly works in this context, right? Because the more, as I was saying in the introduction, the more software eats the world, the larger the overall tech sector is, the overall software sector is, and therefore effectively the ability to clip the ticket for these tech infrastructure companies becomes larger and larger. If you are building a $1 billion, $1 trillion business, it sits on top of infrastructure. Those infrastructure companies provide a lot of value and therefore can extract a lot of value too. I think the one place where the picks and shovel thing breaks down a little bit is, imagine it's a gold rush and you go to the pick and shovel shop and you have got 500 different types of picks and 1,000 shovels and all these other new tools that apparently will get you to your gold faster, but you don't quite understand how they work. And so, I think as someone who's building a startup and someone with a technical background, I think it can be quite overwhelming, the huge range of technical infrastructure that's out there. So I guess, again, going back to what makes a great tech infrastructure startup, how do the really good ones manage to navigate their way through this very crowded space, this very complex space, and break through with teams, with developers?
Well, there's two things because I do want to, I do want to answer that, but something you said earlier, I think also struck me, which is, I think interesting. I talk about a lot with people where going back to software is eating the world, right? Like I think a lot of people when Mark wrote that, like, oh yeah, of course, like Amazon is killing retail and Google is killing classifieds and, it's like tech is, and while that's true, I think the bigger insight there that a lot of people overlooked and what's much more interesting for infrastructure companies and is important is that, at the time, the idea that every single enduring company, regardless of what vertical it is becoming a software company, and meaning like, Domino's Pizza is a world-class software company. The Home Depot is a world-class software company. Maersk Shipping, which is like 100+ years old, is a world-class software company. Like all of these companies now today, and at the time, when that was first put down, like I guess pushing 15 years ago, this was actually much more contrarian and controversial. But now you don't get to be over a certain revenue amount in any vertical without starting to employ software engineers building your own proprietary leverage automation. And therefore, if you're building an infrastructure company, like a horizontal infrastructure company, it's really like a multi-trillion-dollar category. Because like I remember when
It's everyone.
when I was raising money for Vibrato, I used to get these questions from investors, and they'd be like, well, what vertical is this selling to? And I'm like, what do you mean? And they'd be like, well, are you selling, is it health tech or is it financials? Is it commerce? And I was like, well, all of them. And they would kind of blink and be like, it was like a new concept, right? Like, cause they were just used to like, oh, you're selling to someone. And so I ultimately ended up having to like create a slide with just like all these logos from just everywhere to say, no, everyone needs, it's cloud computing infrastructure. Everyone needs this. Going back to your question, which I think is really important, like, because yeah, unlike picks and shovels where it's like, okay, this is pretty much, I've seen them all. It is really, really important. Ideally, the best infrastructure companies, and, they have the ability to provide useful capabilities to a technical practitioner almost immediately in however small a form, and then scale what they can do with you as your usage becomes more sophisticated, as more people on your team start to adopt it, collaboration goes up around it. So like, many of the best companies in this space have, and some of that is innate in the kind of product you're building and selling, but a lot of that is also very intentional in terms of product design, packaging design. Like it's something that great founders think through, like, what does the adoption lifecycle look like for a product like this? And how can I reduce friction at like every stage of that?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I think what you touched on is product-led growth, right? So I think one thing that's pretty common for these infrastructure companies is because developers by definition are very tech savvy and very interested in their tooling and so on, quite often the way into a company is by appealing to those developers and having that sort of grassroots movement within the team. Is that right? And how, I guess, do the best companies take advantage of that dynamic?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it goes so far to say, like specifically at Heavybit, we have a very strong predilection towards what we've always thought of as bottom-up go-to-markets, which I like that term a little bit more than product-led growth because it, I think, captures a little bit more with infrastructure products what's happening. To your point, like the developer brings it in the door, shadow IT. But yeah, we believe just at a high level that two things, I guess. Any category that can be won by a bottom-up go-to-market ultimately will be. And that's not every category. I always use like the example, like, I don't know, HR payroll software. Like nobody comes in on Monday and was like, hey, I tried out the latest payroll system this weekend. It was sick. You have to try it, right? But products used by developers, particularly developers, but technical practitioners, like, yeah, they're always experimenting. They're trying new things. They're always, if you go back to Larry Wall, who wrote the Pearl book, I'm going to date myself here, but one of his qualities in great developers, one of them is like always seeking out ways to like automate their work. And so they're always looking for like new tooling that fits their view of the world. So we believe that particularly in infrastructure products, like not every category, but most of them can be won with this approach. And so we work a lot of the work we do with our founders is on finding go-to-market fit, like figuring out if they can take a bottom-up go-to-market approach, and then if they can, how you do that. It's really, really powerful because, if you think about the innovator's dilemma, right? Like if you hit scale and you succeed and, leaving open down market, a great bottom-up go-to-market captures all of the premier like enterprise top-line revenue, but then also like leverages down market for like lead gen and, top of funnel, which I think, I don't know how much time you've been talking on this topic, but I definitely...
I find this stuff fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you'll indulge me just a bit then, like,
Sure.
One of the things I think that's interesting about these go-to-markets, especially now, and particularly like the PLG folks did a great job. They're better at marketing than we are, I'll say that. But like, they did a great job kind of popularizing this notion and giving people like an ontology and some verbiage to discuss it with. But I think you talk to a lot of people, they're like, oh yeah, PLG, right? So that means like no salespeople. And you're like, well, not exactly. Or that means like, oh yeah, it's a lot of small customers on credit cards and some sales. And really like the goal of a bottom-up go-to-market, and especially in infrastructure, is the exact same goal of like a top-down enterprise sales go-to-market. And that is like ultimately 80-90% of your revenue in a bottom-up go-to-market is going to come from your top, there's like a power lot, like your top 10-20% of your biggest customers, your enterprise customers. Those customers will all be on like multi-year human negotiated deals, right? It's going to look, the bulk of your revenue is going to, you look at just those deals and you'll be like, oh, we do enterprise sales, right? And the beauty of a well-implemented, well-designed, functioning bottom-up go-to-market, of which there's actually very few examples because it's really hard, is that you will have that, but then the bottom 80-90% of your accounts, which are only 10-20% of your revenue, those are really much more of like a marketing exercise expense, right? It's like, how do we get awareness? How do we farm, small startups or whatever that end up growing and becoming large with us? And quite frankly, how do we cut off the oxygen for any potential competitors coming along behind us? How do we meet users where they are, right? Going back to that like journey.
And I think one example of that, I hope you agree that it would be very well known and illustrates it well, is AWS, right? Where AWS really started as this, like, at the beginning, tools for startups and so on, and all the big enterprises were on-prem and, using Oracle or whoever. And still, I would say most startups use AWS, and that's a big part of their go-to-market. It's easy to use, and it got all of that mind share. But if you look at their revenue line, they are serving the Fortune 500, and that's where all the revenue comes from on multi-year deals with a lot of sales folks and so on.
Oh yeah, today to move the needle as a AWS customer, you're talking 9 figures, right, annually. Right.
But AWS still have a startup program, right?
Yep.
Because as you say, it's about making sure that they get that mind share. And I think it's interesting as a sideline that AWS, I think, is maybe losing a little bit of that mind share to GCP on one side, and then to a lot of these like modern platform as a service tools on the other, and starting to seem a little bit old. And I would say that's going to show up in their bottom line in 5 years. It's sort of, there's also this time dimension to it.
Yeah. And look, it's funny, I don't want to like name names or call anyone out, but there's been a number of companies, a classic anti-pattern is a startup, starts down this path and they have kind of a similar trajectory like AWS, albeit, smaller kind of relative size. But they're getting lots of early adoption. They're getting great. And then they end up signing their first few enterprise contracts. They're huge compared to the rest of their customers. They bring in their first VP of sales. And one of the first things that person says is like, oh, wow, well, this is fantastic. And it's great that you did this like kind of toy, bottom up PLG thing, but now we have a real product. I'm a real salesperson. That's just going to hurt us. So we can shut that down. And invariably you see this where they either like really either get rid of it or like shut it down. And then some number of quarters later, the question is like, wait, where did all the leads go? Why are leads so much harder to get? And in many high profile cases like this, people learn that lesson and then go back to their roots.
So one of the reasons I was so interested in talking with you, Joe, is because we have founders who are in all different spaces, but I think there's a certain purity to the tech infrastructure space that illustrates some of these lessons that we try to share with all founders in a really clear way, right? Because there is such a bottom-up motion. There is such a best product wins type of dynamic because developers are so specific about this stuff. And to your point just now, one of the things we talk about on this podcast is that ultimately, when you're building a startup, your aim is to bring in massive revenue. But if you focus too much on your sort of quarterly revenue, your short-term revenue goals, and don't actually focus on the dynamics that allow your business to have that hyper growth, you're going to pay the price. And I think, again, with infrastructure, that focus on the user and that focus on creating a product that is delightful for people, the link between that and your massive enterprise contracts is clearer than in a lot of other spaces. And again, yes, you see every major cloud company, every major tech infrastructure company still focuses on developer experience, still focuses on individual users, on hobbyists, has free plans. And that goes, as you say, very much with enterprise sales. And if you do silly things, as you say, that like just focus on revenue and forget about, nurturing that ecosystem, you will pay the price. And that's really clear in that space.
Yeah, and it's a space too that I think important, particularly for your listeners to know. Like, I think it takes longer to like build and get going, and in part because that purity of like, hey, you have to deliver real value to developers who are like a very discerning audience, and it's very much like, there's a lot of product categories where you can kind of sell a dream and get someone, with a great synthetic demo, and you can like get people on their, an annual contract, and then you're kind of faking until you make it and trying to outrun churn as you build a product to something. But like infrastructure and developer products, like kind of either works or it doesn't, right? And it doesn't take and word spreads pretty quickly both ways, right? Like, hey, if this is great and it's unique and it's novel and that spreads quickly. If it's like, hey, this is snake oil, it doesn't work at all, it breaks this way, that happens too. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of care goes into it, but you can build some really, really big and just very defensible companies. I think importantly, like, if you're a load-bearing piece of infrastructure in someone's tech stack, like that is generally speaking very costly to consider switching out, even even if something slightly better comes along, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember giving a talk over at Google Cloud in the relatively early days of GCP, and they were having a lot of trouble competing against Amazon. And that's because all of their marketing efforts were around switching campaigns. They were looking at AWS shops and they were giving lots of credits and incentives for them to switch. And they said, it's not working. And I said, of course it's not working. If you'd actually spoken to founders, you would have realized that the very last thing they're ever going to do is switch their tech stack, their basic stack, which is going to cost them 12 months and a huge distraction, rather than building their business. And you have to go after startups early. I don't know if they took my advice, but it was very clear what was going wrong.
Yeah, you have to go after startups early. And it's funny that also is a thing with infrastructure founders I work on, or I try to help center them on, where it's also like, hey, I understand that this product, this new category you're creating is this like all-consuming obsession of yours, and it's probably really valuable. But like, remember, at the end of the day, like their customers don't care what their tech stack is, right? Like all their customers care about is the outcomes that they want. And so as an infrastructure company, like it's not enough to be like, oh, this is like feels better, or which by the way helps you get indoors, but like you definitely when you're going to your customers, you have to sell them like real solutions to real problems that ultimately benefit their end users.
Yeah.
Right.
So actually that's one other thing I did want to explore, Joe, because I think another thing about tech infrastructure startups that has that certain purity to it is that there's this common advice that as a founder, you should go and solve a problem that is close to your heart, right? That you're personally passionate about. And so again, you get this virtuous loop where you say, okay, I'm a developer, I'm a tech person, I'm a product person or whatnot, and I have these frustrations. So I'm going to start a startup that builds the tool that I wish existed.
Yep.
Which I think is wonderful and in a lot of ways is very powerful. But I wonder, are there some downsides or risk there where a founder, a developer founder, is a bit too close to their own pain and don't understand well enough the actual shape of the market and the diversity of technology that's out there?
Yeah, that is one of, I think, the most important things I talk with early stage founders about is like what you just said there. It's like this incredibly sharp double-edged sword, which, used correctly is really, really to the startup and founder's advantage, but you have to be really aware of the other edge. And so, yeah, the great side is, you can dog food. Like, first of all, you deeply understand the pain, right? Almost all of the best infrastructure founders, all the ones we back, tend to be these like brilliant, technical minds, technologists. And they have a very clear vision of like some better future for developers or SREs or depth security research, whatever. But they had this very clear idea because they're like lived experience of their pain. And they're like, I know how we can solve this and it'll be a better future for everyone. So some like new category that needs to exist or some existing category that needs to be like fundamentally redefined. And so that's like, especially in the early days, it's fantastic. And yeah, like I said, you can dog food on most of them. You can start building your own startup with it, be like kind of like the old bootstrapping compiler kind of situation, right? Where you get the compiler to the point where it can compile itself. So the problem is, first of all, those people by definition are like, I don't know, top decile, top quintile developers, right? And it's like, okay, you do live in the future and you do understand this pain, but do you understand the other reasons people are struggling with this, right? And I think it's very easy to get lost in the, like a classic thing is like, oh, if only these, if only these stupid users understood, then they would see like why this is the right way to do it, right? And it's sort of like, well, as the founder, as a startup, your job is to ultimately connect through their pain to understanding why you solve it in a way that's the best for them. That's maybe a longer way to describe what we call messaging, right? Like if you've got a very small slice of someone's attention, how do you describe to them what you do in a way that, connects to their problem, that light bulb goes on for them, right? A lot of those smart can have a blind spot about that.
I mean, there's two things that come to me from that. Like one of them is you should still talk to users. Again, standard startup advice.
Always.
But when you're scratching your own itch, it can be easy to forget that bit, right? It's like, okay, yes, I'm a developer with my own pain points, but what are other people's pain points? What are the nuances and subtleties of their pain point? And how does my product apply? Because I imagine, Joe, another thing that makes it more difficult to be a founder in this space is it will tend to be quite crowded and competitive. Again, because as a developer, you're going to naturally gravitate towards building tech infrastructure startup more than some arbitrary domain, right? So there are a lot of people trying to do things in this space, and getting that cut through means really understanding your customer and to your point, really getting that messaging across.
Well, and I think to your point, constantly talk to people. And it's kind of interesting, but I think another way to think about it is if you're talking to people, especially in the early days, and you have yet to find someone who's like, oh, I get why that would be good for users like this, but for a user like me, it's not going to work because X. Like if you haven't found someone like that, I'd be very paranoid because those people are assuredly out there. And, I always talk to founders in terms of like, this is really about like product market fit. Like you got to make sure you're not in a local maxima of some kind, right? Where it's like, oh, you're building what you think is the perfect product, but it turns out that it's like really niche. The example I give this broadly, for a number of years, I'd meet someone or a startup and they'd be doing this great thing. And they're like, oh, we've got like this, hot Series C startup using it and this hot Series B startup using it. And like all these logos who have been on TechCrunch that you've heard of. I'd be like, okay, great. But like, what credit union do you have using it? Or like what, like kind of boring e-commerce company do you have using it? Because I would call those like, hipster enterprises, right? Like if your whole customer list and user list is hipster enterprises,
yeah,
that
it's
is
kind of the YC effect, isn't it? Right? It's like
right?
you've sold it to your whole batch, but nobody else.
Yeah, it's like you do run out of those. And again, I won't name names, but like we had some, companies, and by the way, he still had great exits, but like, they get to like, I don't know, 15 million in ARR, which to an early stage founder sounds like a lot, but then you kind of start to plateau because you run out of those like hot Silicon Valley companies. And really you have to find something that like resonates with like the whole rest of the economy. There are some cases where those companies like here in Silicon Valley are the actual tastemakers. And then there's some cases where they're just like weird and off doing their own thing that, other people won't do. When great examples when founders come out of a place like Google and they're like, hey, we're going to do this just like we did inside Google.
I've been there.
Yeah, fantastic. But like Google is a very unique and strange place. And like, explain to me how this is a problem that the rest of the world has and not a problem that only Google has, right? And it's about...
It's like, we're a startup for multi-terabyte mono repos. It's like, most people don't have that problem.
Yes. And there's more than one of those startups that you just described.
I believe that. Looking for a tech partner to scale your business? Here's one I can personally endorse, Warp Development. With 22 years of experience and 100 plus experts, they deliver custom software and AI solutions that drive results. Visit warpdevelopment.com and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. All the best .coms are taken or crazily overpriced, so you settle on a workaround domain for your website. Don't compromise. Get a clean, sharp .tech domain that instantly says, this is a tech startup. Grab yours at get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast or via domain registrars like GoDaddy. All right, so maybe just to move on a little bit, Joe, one of the things, and I think it does relate to what we've been talking about, that one of the things that surprises people about a lot of tech infrastructure startups is that so many of them are open source. And to somebody coming from a traditional business background, this seems pretty crazy, right? Like, why give away your secret sauce to anybody who wants it for free? So what makes open source so powerful in this space? And what does it teach founders everywhere about the startup mindset?
Yeah. I mean, this is a great question. We've worked, as you might imagine, like you said, given it's kind of in some ways surprising number of infrastructure companies that are open source. We've worked with a number of really great ones, like companies like Gradle, LocalStack, more recently Workbrew, and many more. Actually, I don't know if we can drop in the show notes. We did a conference about 24 months ago we've got all the talks online. It was all about open source business models and go-to-market.
What's it called? I will just, the editors will note this down as they're editing and we can get it in the show notes.
Heavybit Dev Guild, but specifically there's a Heavybit Dev Guild open source. A great question, and there's a couple reasons. And in my personal opinion, having worked with many of these companies, there's a few reasons, right? In the early days, like most startups die from no one knowing that they exist, no one caring that they exist, no one ever using their stuff, right? And open source is like the end all be all, particularly for like technical people like developers, like, hey, just try this out. It's free software. There's no strings attached, so to speak, and let me know if it's valuable, right? And so you can start to build like a community of some sorts and start to get validation around what you're doing. The other thing, importantly, I think if you're starting to think a little more strategic, one of the things that I have come to believe is that basically companies like and as a former technologist, CTO, VPN myself, if I'm accessing a product through like a black box API where someone else, I mean, ultimately I own my own availability. And, if your APIs and, at some point I'll switch off, but like through the API, I'm paying someone else to ultimately manage that availability. If it's my own servers, I don't want proprietary software in my infrastructure, right? Because I am hiring and staffing great engineers, and I need the ability, if something goes wrong, to like crack into that and see if we can somehow alleviate or mediate it until like a more long-term fix can happen. And, my observability company are just great example. Like our original data store we were using before, kind of building our own stuff was on Cassandra. And it was not a large change, Cassandra being a distributed NoSQL database. We had to go in and make a few small changes to the database to make it performant for us. And it's not something that, if it was a proprietary database company, we would not have been big enough to warrant them doing anything. And our use case was too specific for them. They never would have gotten that change in. So I think for most technologists, while I am philosophically into the idea of open source and what it means for everyone, and just broadly speaking in terms of the software ecosystem, I think for a lot of people, open source, it's about the right to inspect and the right to repair. And that's what developers really, really value about open source. So I think there's that. But this is important, open source is not a business model. In fact, to your original question, it's like the exact opposite of a business model, because it's just this is free, we're not charging for it, right? The real question is, how do you build a commercial business model around an open source project community? And that's where every company is unique. There's definitely some repeated themes, anti-patterns, which I think is really interesting.
I mean, I think it's interesting. It may be worth digging into some of those patterns and anti-patterns, especially ones that are more generalizable, because I guess one of the things that to me resonates about this open source idea and what you talked about, building a community, tying it back to that product-led growth as well, is it's nearly a kind of abundance mindset, right? Again, I'm based in Australia. We see a lot of fantastic investors here, but also I think outside of Silicon Valley, you'll find investors a little bit more conservative, a little bit more tied to traditional business models. And the idea that you give away something for free, that you put a huge amount of value into the world, and that you make sure that you have a way of capturing some of that value as revenue, but that you don't kind of pre-optimize or, optimize prematurely for revenue, when what you're really trying to do is get that traction. And to your point, Joe, that the biggest problem most startups face is that nobody ever notices their thing. And so giving it away for free, reducing friction, allowing it to be inspected, not insisting on that value exchange from day one is really a great way to build that momentum, build that mind share. And then I don't think you should have blind faith, which is why I'm interested in asking about the patterns and anti-patterns, but I think you should have a plan where you say, we can capture that value later. We have a mechanism that allows us, if we create large value in the world, to capture a decent piece of it for ourselves, and that makes us a viable business.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, look, so in the earliest days, I'm talking to early stage founders who are planning, like, have an open source project of some kind. They want to build a company around it. The thing I talk to them the most is like, okay, let's take a step back and let's think really strategically. Like if we fast forward 5-7 years, what does success look like at scale? And asking the exact questions kind of you just stated, which is like, at that point in time, when we're at scale, what is going to be the value we are providing to the community that is free to them, and that we don't feel bad that we're not monetizing, right? Or I think a lot of companies run into trouble is they just like, everything is free and open source from the start. They say, hey, we'll figure it out later. And then you get down the road and you find yourself in a situation where, the rational thing for one of your potential customers to do, if you've put everything they need in the open source project, I think a lot of founders get to that point and then get stymied or frustrated because they're like, hey, the enterprise is telling me they don't want to pay for my, commercial product, which is really just like a thin set of aesthetics on top of the open source thing. They're telling me they can do everything they need with the open source thing. And that makes me angry because that's really unfair. And it's like, no, that is the rational thing for that prospective buyer to do. And it's just like, you missed the mark on where you kind of drew the line in the sand, right? There's different schools of thought here. Like Adam Jacobs, who founded Ceph Software, and he's just great. I mean, he's written volumes on this, around the idea of like using trademark protection, so to speak. Basically, if you're the distribution, right? If you own the name of the project and you're the only one who can distribute binaries, there's a lot you can do there. And I think that's true. I tend to prefer, I like to think of it more along the lines of that bottom up, which is probably part of it. Like ideally, what's the value that like one user or just a handful of developers working together, like maybe like a seed stage startup team, 4 or 5 developers, that they can get, right? And what do they really care about? And then what, if you were to scale this up to enterprise usage, like what do they care about, right? And I think like a great category to run this thought exercise is like databases, especially because going back to like my earlier comments, databases are one place where I think it's nigh on impossible to conceive of a new proprietary database, right? Because I just think the industry is like, no, I'm not. We've got one Oracle, that's enough, right? Like,
Yeah.
And so, but that's an industry where, okay, single user developer mode, I just need a database to run on my laptop, or I need like a single node instance up on a platform as a service. But if I want like, a log replication or like more like audit controls or compliance governance or like more sophisticated clustering or scaling or performance tools, like it can start to separate into like, okay, at what point should you be paying for a more enterprise grade version of this database to run your production workloads in? And so, I think looking at the value the open source project provides, like ideally it's a rich enough area where you can kind of like segment and say, okay, there's just tons and tons of prospective functionality to build. Here's what we'll start with for free and open source, and be generous there, right? Like it's not the other trap people fall into is they're like, oh, here's this open source thing. And you're like, it barely does literally anything, right? And the second I kind of glance at it for too long, if I need the enterprise version, right? So still be generous, still accept that like part of, by giving that value to the world, you're going to make a bigger pie. But then, also like make sure you're thinking from day one is like, hey, what is the commercial entity going to do? Because you always have two separate products, whether it's purely a distribution play or if it's more of a like separation or segmentation rather, there's always a commercial product that is not the open source software.
I think there's this interesting balance, as you say, Joe, right? You want to have this abundance mindset. You want to make sure people notice you. You want it to be easy to use, create huge value in the world without acting as a gatekeeper to any of it. But if you're too generous, if you don't have any way of making money, right? Because ultimately a startup needs to make money, you end up shooting yourself in the foot. And so, yeah, you need to, I guess it's more of an art than a science, I imagine, but you need to think, what are those leverage points where enterprises or whatnot, the big payers will pay for something that is not in the free offering.
Yeah, I think where you draw the final line is definitely a bit of art. I know it's one of those things where like all models are wrong, but some are useful. And it's just like being intentional and methodical about what you decide and then paying attention to, like listen to what the world tells you, adjust where you need to. I guess the other thing is important is just to accept there will be, if you're trying to build some kind of a commercial entity, no matter what you do or how much you give away, there's going to be some people, loud voices out there who are very perturbed by the idea that you might be trying to build like a sustainable commercial entity to keep, building the project. It's funny. Not that there hasn't been bad investor behavior as we as an industry have continued to learn and iterate on how to do this. But one of the things I think is great, like there have been like just billions and billions of dollars of venture capital poured into commercial open source companies. And like, ultimately that's resulted in a whole bunch of like commercial open source software that like tons and tons of other companies are built on, that was paid for by, someone else's like, investments and speculation. And I think that's like a really good thing that it makes sense that commercial open source software companies can exist. And it makes sense for the investment, like the asset class, to invest in it, because that means more open source software for all of us as developers, right? And one of the reasons I'm kind of so passionate about this is like, I want to find a way where to continue to find ways where open source software makes sense to create it and it's available for people and we're always making more of it. But also makes like just fiduciary sense to invest in those things, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's incredible.
Tricky balance.
The impact that open source has had on the world. If you think about the entire internet would not exist without this foundation of open source software. It's incredible.
Yeah. At the conference event I mentioned, I opened with a small keynote. And I think I just like started, I was just like, open source software is like basically the most transformative force in the history of IT. Right. And, maybe AI is going to make a run at that. We'll see. But, I'd still stand by that, at least today.
Okay. Well, we have gotten more than 30 minutes into the chat before we first mentioned AI, but it's the perfect segue, Joe, because that was going to be my next question, or the next topic is we've talked about software eating the world, but it does now seem that AI is starting to eat software. And so how is AI changing the infrastructure world? And how would you advise other founders to think about the role that AI plays in shaping their startup?
Yeah, great question. Obviously still very early days, but I think what's been fascinating, even in the last 18 months, 12, 18 months, if you look back, just like how quickly AI has started to impact software development and, therefore infrastructure, right? And one of the things that's interesting is when the ChatGPT moment happened, as they say, like back in November of 23 or whenever precisely was. So we're closing in on 2 years ago. Obviously everybody's like, whoa, this is, has potentially massive, potential. And you could imagine all these different ways it could impact all these different industries. And, my partners and I were kind of immediately like, oh, this is definitely has potential impacts in software development and infrastructure. It's been surprising to the extent where it's like, oh, what are the things this could be possibly good at? And one of the things it is absolutely the best at as we speak today, I would claim it's absolutely the best at like basically next generation search. Like a lot of my usage of ChatGPT is basically some form of a query that I previously would have put in Google. And instead of me opening 5 tabs and manually kind of scanning each one, and it just does that for me. So I think search, like the next generation of search, is still the killer use case. But like, I'd argue like code generation is probably number two. I mean, you look at like companies, not just like Anthropic and Claude Code, but Cursor, and I mean, the usage there is undeniable, right, in terms of adoption rates. Yeah, so it's eating. I think it's analogous to that. Like AI is eating infrastructure, eating software development, and it's really interesting to think through the impacts of that and what that means and why that is, I guess.
I imagine as an investor in this space, you need to put your money where your opinion is, right? Which
Yeah.
is like, I imagine a lot of tech infrastructure startups these days have AI kind of pretty core to their thesis. So yeah, how do you think about that?
Yeah. So, one of the things I look for, so I am still as bullish as I am on AI and its impacts in software development, but both already what we've observed and what I think is going to happen. I'm still rather bullish on the role of humans moving forward in software development, or
Hmm.
maybe role is the wrong word, the existence of humans in software development. Because I do think what's going to change pretty dramatically is the role that humans play in that software development, at least as compared to historically. Like the job is going to look a lot different. There are some people who I think are more maximalists and believe that like, oh, we're going to, get rid of software engineers or software developers. So that's going to be like the lamp lighters or bowling pin resetters when we're talking in 25 years. And I don't believe that. So I'm much more interested in products and infrastructure technologies that like give human users superpowers, remove toil from human users' daily metabolism, and allow them to focus on their like highest leverage activities. And it's kind of interesting to think about. If software development really is this like, we call it knowledge work. Well, what does that mean, right? It's this creative, cognitive activity where as a human software engineer, we're faced with some kind of a business problem and we conceptualize like, okay, given our existing software systems and this new business requirement or problem, what changes do we need to affect architecturally? Really, you're thinking at a high level, right? Like architecturally, and like what capabilities do we need? And once you figure that out, then you say, or historically at least, you say, okay, now I need to actually like write the JavaScript or like the CSS or, the backend code to implement that. And that's and then to actually do that, you have to put your like meat sausages on a physical mechanical device, right? To transmute all this stuff you've thought into another digital kind of domain, right? And so that's probably takes up, and it's brittle and error prone, and probably is like, I don't know, for an IC, like, 50, 60, 70, 80% of your time is spent, doing that. And what AI kind of promises to do is, much like we're not punching zeros and ones on the paper cards anymore, like it's sort of, I think, like the next level up where I can just I can have a conversation with Claude about like, hey, I want to do X, Y, Z. And then maybe it says, oh, okay, well, have you thought about this? And then we go back and forth a little bit and they say, go do that. And then it creates the result and I can review it and then we can decide to commit it. But it's moving us into a much higher level of abstraction, which if done correctly, is like dramatically increase what a single person can accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with what you're saying. And my hypothesis, if you'll indulge me, I'd be interested in your thoughts, is it
Yeah,
does
totally.
lead to an increasing convergence between the software engineer role and the product manager role. And what I mean by that is I think some people, like you say, perhaps the more maximalist ones will say, oh, you don't need engineers anymore. Product managers can just, create the PRD and AI will do it for you. And I don't agree with that either. I think that core technical skill is just as important as ever. But when what you are coding is more like a product requirements document, you have this convergence where I think the sort of the product hat and the engineering hat can be worn by the same person. Or put it this way, like if you have the two circles in the Venn diagram, they kind of, the area of overlap grows. And perhaps at an early stage startup, the same role both roles can be filled by a strong hybrid product engineer, right? So I think there's less room for engineers who don't understand product. There's probably less room for product managers who don't understand technology. And so over time, these roles converge.
Yeah, I think that's like spot on. And part of why I'd say that is like, I think historically, like, at least for me, the best software engineers I ever worked with and the kind of people I wanted to hire and have working for me cared about the business, right? Like there's this kind of trope or meme about like,
It's always been true.
yeah, always been true. And what's changing, I think, is what you were just hitting on, is that that's going to move from like, oh, those are the best ones to like, this is just the job. And so if you don't care about the business, if you don't care about product, if you just want to write code, well, it turns out the value of like writing code is like probably going close to zero. The value of like understanding the business, what it needs, and also understanding how software runs and works and is created and managed, and crossing that bridge with these tools, is that value is going way up. And so, yeah, I think when I think about like what kind of software engineers, aren't going to exist in the future, it's not software engineers as a class or even skill level, but it's like, software engineers with missing certain aptitudes or interests, right? And kind of like what you're talking about.
And the same for product managers. I think product managers who don't understand more of the nitty gritty of how tech is built, because again, like you said, the best, it's always been true, the best software engineers have been strong at product. In my experience, and I know others would agree, the best product managers often have an engineering background as well, or at least know how to write code and how to build software. So it's always been true. But as we say, in both cases, the people who are sort of on the outside of that Venn diagram, their role becomes less and less tenable, right? You kind of need to be a double threat to be either a product manager or an engineer in this new world.
Yeah, I think that's right. And same for like designers. Best designer I ever worked with was like really great at, JavaScript, jQuery. And yeah, I mean, just the ability to like,
same.
What's interesting to me about also with the AI stuff is, because assuming that's all true, a question I always ask people, I'm like, well, do you think the world's appetite for software is like done, right? Because like, if you look over the history of IT, every single time, and maybe every productivity, whether it's like, compilers or memory management or cloud computing or whatever, it's not like we said, oh, good, we solved the last generation's problems, we're done with software now. We just kind of like raise the ambitions of what we have for software, right? I mean, if you compare to like the piece of software running on mainframes in the 60s or 70s to something like, Uber, in the mobile, we just always try to do more. And the other thing I really like, so that's always been true. And I think that's true of this one. Like, if you're saying like, hey, a software engineer, like there's no company prior to LLMs that said, good, we have enough software engineers, right? No company ever had said that. Like LLMs will help with that, but historically speaking, you just always want to make more software because there's just always more things you could do. Like backlogs have never been empty. But the other thing that's new about this that really fascinates me, and maybe there's pieces of this, but it's really, really here now, is there's a whole class and long tail of software that historically has not existed, because even like people like you or I, like in our personal life or whatever, like hobbyists, will see something and I'm like, oh man, if I had a free couple weeks, like I could write something that would like automate this or like make it really a nice experience, really niche and tailored. But like the economics, pre-LLMs, the economics of creating relatively simple software just don't work, because it's like if you need even 2 engineers, right? And certainly in like a place like the Bay Area or whatever, suddenly you're like, oh, we're talking fully loaded, like $500K a year. Solving this problem is not worth that. But now if it's something that like, oh, I can one shot a little SPA on, Claude or Lovable or Bolt or whatever. Like I can do that. And I have a piece of software where historically I wouldn't have created one. So I think lowering the activation energy is, I think, going to dramatically increase the long tail of software that's created. We just invested in a company called Vibes.diy, which is basically
great name,
trying to bring, these kind of apps to the general masses.
Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, I agree. So you've lowered the activation energy. And I think in the context of AI, everyone in AI has discovered the economic concept called Jevons paradox, right? Which is that the cheaper something gets when it's valuable, if something gets lower cost, you don't end up spending less of your overall budget on it. You actually end up spending more because there are so many more things you can do, right? So every time it's gotten cheaper to build software, we've ended up with more software engineers, more of global GDP being spent on building software. And there's no reason to think that the acceleration in velocity created by AI would make that any different.
Yeah.
So just changing pace. I know a lot of founders are listening to this show, and one thing that is very scary for founders, especially non-technical ones, but even technical ones, I'm going through this myself. I'm in an early stage startup, is choosing their tech stack as they start to build. There is no one size fits all. There's always new tools coming out, new paradigms. But what are some guidelines that you would give people, founders, when they start building in terms of choice of stack? Because as we mentioned earlier, Joe, once you've chosen your stack, it's very sticky. It's hard to move away from it.
Yeah, no, this is interesting. There's a few guidelines, and I talk with a lot of early stage founders about this. So, the first thing I tell them is like, don't overthink it. Don't get into paralysis by analysis, right? Like, think for your particular use case, what are your like key design constraints, and optimize for that. The most important thing, I think it was Jeff Bezos was talking about more business decisions that applies here. Like what's a one-way door? What's a two-way door? And like, yes, like switching infrastructure is hard. And there is the whole, like, nothing's more permanent than a temporary solution. But I think in terms of a startup, especially a super early stage startup, going back to what we were saying about like, hey, your single biggest problem is no one cares that you exist, and you have to give someone a reason for that. So like, no one cares how meticulous or perfect your tech stack is. Like, no one will ever care that, but they certainly don't care now. So like, it's all about speed. So like, the one thing that's most important is like, how can you move the most quickly to the extent you can do things that don't scale? Like, how do you do that? Even just looking at your existing team, like, what are the existing skill sets and kind of tools and processes your existing team is comfortable with? Because I would say, again, for that early stage startup, if there's a tool or process that's like maybe, a generation or two ago, and there's like some new hotness everyone's talking about, unless there is like a just massive kind of clear extreme benefit to the new version, like, you should go with the thing your team knows and they can move more quickly, right? I would call them like beach problems, right? We'd be talking about a piece of like an infrastructure decision, and a smart engineer, because they're always thinking, they're like, oh, well, this is going to work up to X, Y, Z, but then after that, it's going to be a problem. And I would say, okay, cool. But like, by the time we get to the scale where we hit X, Y, Z, I'm going to be on a beach somewhere, and that's going to be someone else's problem. So like, let's make sure, engineers historically, and because obviously your engineering team, your CTO, they're going to have a lot of, almost all the input, but like, they love in the earliest days to have a threat model of like, oh, this isn't going to scale. And it's like, great, that is the problem I want to have. I want us to be waking up one morning and saying like, shoot, our user base is growing like crazy, adoption's off the charts, this isn't going to scale. That's when we solve that problem. But like in the early day, it's all about like, what's the single fastest way to iterate until we find product market fit, right? Other extreme examples, it's infrastructure, but I think it helps illustrate this, right? Like, founders are always like, oh, what CRM should we use? And I'm like, oh, good news. Like, just literally check a few out, like whatever people are talking about, whatever vibes with you best, it's fine. Because if we're so fortunate to like be around in a few years, it'll be Salesforce, right? Like, whenever we get to a point where we hire like a proper VP sales CRO, they're going to move us to Salesforce no matter what CRM you pick right now. So just like, don't sweat it.
An element of pragmatism that you're speaking to here, right? In two different ways. One is that you should probably go with the default technology stack. There are network effects to these things, right? One is it tends to get more development attention. It will probably continue to be improved over time. The other is, when you're hiring engineers, one of the hardest things is to hire good engineers. You don't want to be working in some niche stack and just making your hiring job that much harder, right? So, if you've heard of these things, if you're like, oh yeah, people tend to use React and Node and Supabase, and it's like, you're probably 90% of the way there because that's what everyone's using these days, and it will be easy to find people. And clearly, if they were terrible, people wouldn't be using them.
I mean, I like that framing. Another way, I'm definitely of the school of thought, like, your tech stack should be boring. Like, at some level, it should be boring because it's like well understood, and a lot of people have heard of it. And, sometimes, people use this concept of an innovation token, where it's like, hey, as a startup, you have a very small, limited number of like innovation tokens, and they should mostly be an innovation token, meaning where it's like, oh, I'm going to do something weird and new and risky, right? as opposed to like this is just what mostly everybody does. And you really want to spend those tokens on your like actual product and like creating something new. You don't want to spend those tokens ideally on like, again, how do I do database recovery or failover, right? Like that's just something, again, your users, your theoretical users literally could care less as to like how beautiful or pristine or new or cool your infrastructure is. And so like, yeah, your default should be boring tech. It should always be like, we're going to go with the boring, obvious solution. And it should be the onus to adopt something like kind of new and crazy should be like, no. And again, for me, I was talking about Cassandra earlier, hosting like a web scale time series database monitoring service. That was just something where that was some crazy early stage tech, but it allowed us to do something like it was like a capability shift, right? Which we otherwise wouldn't have been able to build a business. But like that's the kind of test you should have for new tech.
Exactly. So boring tech that everybody's using and with a bias towards speed. And I think that's actually another hiring lesson, perhaps, that you kind of alluded to earlier, right? When we were actually talking about founders then, but if you get folks that come from Google or from some other big company, right? They're used to dealing with problems of massive scale.
Yes.
And what you are doing at an early stage startup is you want to move fast. And, technical debt, this is one of the things I like to say is that technical debt, I like the analogy because it's like financial debt. There's bad debt and there's good debt. And as an early stage startup, you should be taking on quite a lot of technical debt.
Yeah.
But you should be doing it thoughtfully and carefully, mindfully. But if you're not taking technical debt, which is, the same way as when you borrow money, you're pulling the future forward, you're moving too slowly. And so having engineers who are not so pristine or principled that they can't get a little bit dirty and take on some tech debt to move quickly, that's one challenge that I see at early stage startups.
Yeah, I mean, I think I love the word pragmatism that you used. I use that a lot, and then I had in But yeah, you want to be like just relentlessly pragmatic. Like successful early stage startups are like a never ending stream of trade-offs, right? And so you need some principles on just like what those trade-offs are. Another lens, which is actually super important, because going back to speed, I think every single change, prospective change in your infrastructure stack, like, we're going to start doing, whether it's a new tool or it's a new process, it should first be viewed through the lens of like, okay, we're doing things a certain way today. If we make this change, how does that affect the speed at which a developer can get a change from idea to production, right? Like that's cycle time, right? And any change to infrastructure or production that increases cycle time needs to just be really carefully looked at. And anything that reduces cycle time, like obviously, have to check safety and whatever, but we should have a strong predilection. Because I think especially for early stage startups, like that cycle time is almost everything, because it determines your learning time, it determines your experimentation time. And so I was always, my head of SREs ended up calling it like Ruscio's law. I was just obsessed with like, how quickly can our developers move by themselves, right?
Yep, I completely agree. And, and that maybe brings us full circle in the sense of choose tech infrastructure built by developers, by founders who are obsessed with cycle time. And a lot of the best infrastructure, like I said, I'm going through my early stage journey at the moment. I'm getting to play with the latest stuff. Like everything that is good about tech infrastructure these days is about taking away that friction and just saying we go from idea to production super quickly. And I'm loving it.
Yeah, I mean, and going back to what makes a great infrastructure company, like you said, and what we look for is like, how does this improve their end user developers' lives? How does it make them faster? How does it make them more productive? How does it give them more leverage? And, the other interesting thing about is you want to like zoom way out. What I love about infrastructure is, every time we kind of like raise the level and the substrate of what we have, and we like kind of conquer the previous generation's problems, like we're moving faster, we're more decoupled, we're scaling more, and that just we find new problems that then we have to solve with infrastructure. It's this kind of like never-ending cycle.
Joe, this has been an absolutely fantastic, fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. I know everyone listening will be too. I just wanted to finish up by asking you if there is one thing you would like people listening to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
Yeah, so I think one of the things, and it kind of branches and covers maybe several things that we touched on, but like we're at this really exciting moment, probably for me, the certainly most exciting moment since, cloud computing kind of kicked off. where, AI and its possibilities are sort of like rewriting maybe what's possible. But I also want to, at least I personally believe, and it's important for founders out there, as much as this is enabling and potentially changing kind of the way we do everything day to day, I also think there's a whole bunch of things that aren't changing at all. And that's like businesses, startups, like we have to provide products, like humans working with capital, create value. And, I like, even if cognitive work is redefined, or maybe a better way to put it, if like what has historically been cognitive work is going to be like kind of massively, taken by these agents and LLMs, we're just going to redefine, we're going to find new levels of cognitive work. And I think focusing on that, saying, okay, with these capabilities, what do the humans do in the future, leads to really interesting new businesses. So I know some people are like, oh, isn't software done, infrastructure done? And I think nothing could be further from the truth.
I agree with that. There's an author I love called Morgan Housel. His most famous book is called The Psychology of Money, but the one I really love is his most recent one called Same as Ever. And he comes from an investor perspective, right? Which is, He talks about all the things that despite how the world changes and all of these new trends that are just always the same as ever because they're rooted in human nature. And I feel like maybe we need a book like that for tech products. But yeah, a lot of things stay exactly the same no matter how revolutionary the tech is.
Yeah, I always like to tell people, startups, companies, it's messy human wetware all the way down. So
Absolutely.
Some things don't change.
It's we haven't upgraded the people.
Not yet.
Joe, thanks so much for being so generous with your time. If people want to find you online, follow your journey or your thoughts, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm under my full name, Joseph Ruscio, in print, and that's on LinkedIn, Twitter, GitHub. Follow me on all those places. I blog Heavybit. We have a really active kind of content program and video library. So there's a bunch of talks and transcriptions I have in there. I'm starting up my own podcast, if I could plug that here. It's called High Leverage. You can find a few experimental episodes online, but we're going to be kicking that back off pretty soon. So talking mostly to founders and builders with these kind of companies, if that space interests you.
Fantastic. And of course, I imagine if you're a founder building a tech infrastructure startup and looking to talk to some investors, you should reach out to Heavybit.
Yeah, I mean, you just find us at heavybit.com, and you can see the whole team there. You can reach us, like I said, through various social media or LinkedIn networks, but also we just straight up have a form. You can just like put in just a quick couple details about what you're doing. We're geo-agnostic. We invest all over the world, North America, Europe, even Australia, New Zealand. Reach out. We love to talk shop. We're all product geeks at heart. And we invest kind of exclusively in the early stage. So everything from day zero, pre-seed through seed and up to the Series A.
Fantastic. Okay. Thanks again, Joe, for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it, and have a good one.
Yeah, thanks. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
This episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Warp Development. I know a lot of you rely on dev agencies to help build your product. Problem is, a lot of these agencies suck. Ask me how I know. I've been looking for one that I can really endorse, and I have finally found one. Warp Development are the powerhouse behind countless successful startups and enterprises for over 22 years. They have over 100 experts who don't just code, they solve business problems alongside you. From custom software to AI consulting, Warp Development delivers results that move your business forward. And they're in your time zone. They have offices in Australia, the United States, and South Africa, so you get local support with global expertise. Are you ready to build something that matters? Visit warpdevelopment.com. That's warpdevelopment.com, and mention the Startup Podcast for a free consultation. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by .tech domains. Naming your startup should be easy, but it isn't, because all the good .com names are taken or wildly overpriced. No more. You don't have to compromise. Your domain shows your focus and intent, so make it sharp, clean, and unmistakably tech with a .tech domain. How do you do that? Head to www.get.tech/TSP or a registrar like GoDaddy and grab your .tech domain today. Get.tech/TSP for the Startup Podcast so they know you came from us.